Hi, everybody, and welcome to your history agenda for the week of April 20th through the 24th, 2020. Now, this one I think is going to be, though, more work, obviously, than last week when we've had our shortened week due to the Easter holidays prior. Um, It'll be more work, but I think it's going to be some pretty enjoyable work. I think you guys will really like this. What we're going to focus on this coming week, April 20 through 24, and actually it goes into your summative work too, is we're going to be looking at youth protest in the 1960s into the 1970s. So, of course, the first thing you're going to do with that is you are going to go back to our text, right? Our good friend, the text. And yes, you have to do notes this time around because it's a normal week. I know you got a break from that last week, so you're going to have to do the notes. But this is going to be in chapter 6 of the text. Last week we did feminism, chapter 7. This week we are looking at chapter 6 on the youth protest movement, of course, the United States, Canada, and then Latin America as well. So first you're going to do the notes, and I'll have a spot for you to submit those notes. As always, that will be due at the end of the week. 11:59 Friday evening is kind of usually when I have that due date and time. So you'll be working on that first. As you are doing that, of course, there's the summative with this chapter. So as you are taking your notes, you want to keep the main idea of the summative in mind. And of course, it will be jumping directly off of the idea of youth protest. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over here. I can't switch to a screen recording for you guys, but I'll switch over my screen and I'm going to basically read off for you guys what you're going to be doing with this summative and how it ties in as I read it. All right, I've already posted it up. I added the directions in the fourth quarter summative number 1, where I've already put that into Canvas. I added now the directions, so they're there. You can read along if you like, and I would definitely go back and read them. But I'm going to go through and explain a few things because this is what's going to be, once you're done with the reading, then taking up your time. Now, one thing that the summative will be due on the 27th, which is the following Monday. So you have a couple of days during the week, split up your reading, get that done, and then you have a few days to work on the actual summative. But you want to know what the summative is as you're doing your reading so you can think about what you're going to want to do with your summative. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to look at the directions myself. I know it's not going to switch over for you, but I will read through them and explain a few things as I go here. So this is really, really important. So what you're going to be doing is something I call a musical exploration for this. All right. So for this summative, it says you'll be comparing and contrasting protest music from the 1960s and 70s. And in fact, you may find music a little bit earlier than that kind of bleeds into this time period, but I'll explain that in a second. So your task is to select at least one song from each decade that protests a social, economic, or political reality from that time. So, as you're reading about the youth protest movement, look at the types of things they are protesting, right? Now, we know some big things off the top of our head have been going on. Obviously, there have been protests about rights. There have been equal rights. There have been protests about gender equality. We also know there in the 1960s, though we haven't talked about it really too much yet, we obviously know there is a major protest about the involvement of the United States in the Vietnam War. So there's all kinds of things going on, but you don't have to pick Vietnam if you don't want to, even though that was a big deal. If you are really interested in issues of economic disparity and you find stuff about that or labor relations or things like that, whatever you find really interesting, that's what I kind of want you to gear this towards. So if you're doing your reading about the protest movement and you're like, yeah, I know it talks a lot about Vietnam, but there's a couple of other things that they talk about that the youth were protesting against, and I'm actually more interested in that. Well, then why don't you gear your musical summative toward that issue and see what kind of music you can find that addresses that issue. Now, that might take some searching, but I think you'll enjoy it. So, you'll be comparing and contrasting protest music from the 1960s, or like I said, if you find stuff a little earlier into the 50s, like in the folk music scene, you can use that too, as the early time period for the protest movement, and then later on into maybe the early 1970s. And find some stuff from later in the protest movement. And, you know, with the major issues that were being protested in the 1960s primarily, even though not just in the 1960s, you can probably find some music that is addressing these issues from the 60s, early 60s, maybe even the late 50s, depending on what you're looking at, in the 1960s into the 70s. So you're going to need at least two pieces of music dealing with this aspect of protest that you're interested in. I would strongly suggest using multiple, finding more, because depending on what you choose to do, you may find there's a lot of different music out there. And plus, you might just enjoy it, and therefore you just keep going down the rabbit hole, and you end up with a whole lot of evidence to talk about what you want to talk about, which is fantastic. No problem at all. But what you'll be doing is analyzing the lyrics and how are they talking about these things that are going on. You're going to compare and contrast the songs, right, from the early time period to the later time period to see how things change. How does what's going on change through the music? All right, so we're looking at not just what is being protested using the music, but we're also looking at how that changes and how popular opinions and culture is being demonstrated through the music. All right, so it's and you'll be comparing and contrasting. The evidence you're going to be using to compare and contrast here is the music itself. Okay, those are going to be your primary sources. Can you go out and use some secondary stuff that you read maybe about a song or think that's great too. But the only primary sources I will require for this is going to be the songs themselves, the lyrics, whatever else you're going to need to talk about to show how things are protested and how it shows itself through the music and how it changes from early on in maybe the late 50s into the early 1960s, then into the late 60s, into the early 70s. And so what I did is I gave you, because I know not everybody's a kind of a older music junkie like I am. I love music from that era. So I gave you guys kind of places where you can start from, especially earlier in the 60s, and some of this is even, mid to late 50s, that you can kind of get a jump start for. First off, you've got a lot of different artists and songs to go off of. Bob Dylan, of course, is one of the biggest names from that time period. And I've just given you a list of songs that you could kind of go off of, depending on what you're wanting to look at, right? What issue you're wanting to look at. A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, Blowing in the Wind, Masters of War, Oxford Town, The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, The Times They Are Changin', With God on Our Side, and there's a lot more. I've got another artist that maybe you may not be familiar with, a guy by the name of Phil Ochs, spelled O-C-H-S. He was a big name in kind of that folk music scene in the 1960s. Then he passed away in the 70s. But he's got some albums that could be a good starting point from the early to mid 60s. Things like All the News That's Fit to Sing and I Ain't Marching Anymore. Take from California's in a later 60s. Then you have artists like Pete Seeger, also from the folk music scene, kind of a legend of the folk music scene. The Battle of Old Monroe, Waist Deep in the Big Muddy, Where Have All the Flowers Gone, Last Train to Nuremberg, Talkin' Union, talking about labor issues, Banks Made of Marble, labor and economic issues, This Land Is Your Land, We Shall Overcome, which side are you on, and what did you learn in school today? So, as it says here, these are only suggested starting points. Like you can use anything. There's tons of artists out there. There's tons of songs. I've just given you 3 artists from the folk music scene, right? Pete Seeger coming in really in the 1950s, and then Dylan and Phil Ochs coming in the early 60s. But these are just from the folk music scene, which would be probably a good starting point for those early years of where protest is making its way into music. But then, of course, I haven't put anything here about pop music acts from the 1960s and when they start to shift over and start to talk about current issues. Groups like the Byrds, groups like, obviously, the Beatles, of course, end up shifting over. Lots of pop and rock acts begin doing the same thing. I'm just giving you a starting point here, since I know some of you may be more familiar with some of those bigger names, and maybe just don't know about these kind of early folk music folks to this extent. So I'm just giving you a starting point. All right, they're only suggested starting points. You may find some stuff that's totally different and not use any of the information I've given you here. I'm just a place to start if you need it. And of course, this is going to be on our friend's standard D. And I've got there in the directions all the substandards for standard D that you guys are now familiar with. Remember, you got to use those primary sources to prove both sides of your similarity and difference argument. Okay? So make sure you've got that there. So keep this idea in mind when you're reading and taking notes on Chapter 6, because you might say, oh wow, that's definitely an issue that they protested that I'm really interested in. I'm gonna see how this made its way into music in the early days, and then as time goes on into the late 60s, into the 1970s. All right? And for this, you don't have to cross international boundaries. You can just do the United States. That's fine. But you will find with certain aspects of rights and protests that there is a lot of bleed over. International groups are writing songs and performing music, protesting aspects of things that are happening in other countries. I mean, it's just the way it is. So you never know what you might find. So I'm hoping you'll really find that enjoyable. And those are your 2 big goals for the coming week. As always, please drop in any of my Zoom meetings, anything like that. If you need help, if you need some guidance, I know this music isn't everybody's cup of tea. You don't have the background and knowing a lot about it. So I will point you in the right direction, and maybe you have some friends and classmates actually that really love this era of music and can point you in the right direction. Hey, there's nothing wrong with that either. So that's what's the deal for April 20th through the 24th, but then of course moving into the 27th, which is our first summative for 4th quarter, until right after we will be transitioning into our internal assessment. All right, guys, have a great week.